might speak to you in very different ways. They might speak to you in very different ways while they both represent what we might akin to food. Now, the picture on your left represents the 20th century and the Industrial Revolution. While the Industrial Revolution brought things like the assembly line, things like the factory, it also brought greater efficiencies in production and distribution. Now, on one side of the scale, we can produce and ship food faster. On the other side, we do it at the compromise of quality and control. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd much prefer my car parts roll off the assembly line than my dinner ham. Regardless, now contrast that with the picture on your right. Do you think any of these family members are worried about efficiency in production? Are they concerned about how quickly their food is going to get to the grocery store? Do they wish they were standing in a lineup at a cashier on Cheap Tuesday in Ceylon Foods? I doubt it. Now, water is certainly our most scarce resource. It garners a lot of attention, and for good reason. As you can see, the industrial agricultural system uses almost 2/3 of our total global water supply. Now, agriculture uses water in two different ways. One through irrigation, and one that we're all very accustomed to around here. And two, through pollution. Now, I'm going to discuss irrigation now. I'll get into pollution a little bit later. Through irrigation, and this is more typical in semi-arid environments, we're depleting our aquifers much faster than they can be recharged, which is alarming. Not only that, but when we irrigate, typically we over-irrigate, and as a result of this, we leave salt deposits on the soil. And as many of you may know, salt deposits erode the Earth's ability, the soil's ability to produce. Now, that fact leads to the fact that in the US, 28% of arable cropland is actually too salty to grow on. And in China, that number is at 23% and growing quite steadily. So our current food supply system, this is what we're talking about. This is a graphic pictorial of how it currently operates. There's a few problems that are inherent with this system, the way we understand it. First, you might notice it's very lineal in nature. It goes from source to sink. There's no recycling of outputs as inputs. There's no productive use of waste resources. And because of this, much like a chain, should any one of these links fail, the whole system will screech to a halt. Which is why it's often said, should the trucks stop running, we'd only have enough food in our grocery store shelves to feed us for 2 to 3 days. Now, another issue that is not on this picture, but at each stage of the process, there requires inputs. Water, which I just discussed, and fossil fuels at every single stage. Now, speaking of fossil fuels, what we're hoping we can help you to understand is there's a certain amount of energy that is required to produce and to bring your food to your table. Now, this represents, as you'll see, 10.3 quads to 1.4. That's a 7-to-1 ratio. So what that means is it takes 7 kilocalories worth of energy to produce 1 kilocalories worth of food. Now, contrast that to a typical small-scale farming operation, which operates at a 3-to-1 ratio. Or, more drastically, your typical feedlot operation, which operates at a 35-to-1 ratio. Now, on the topic of fossil fuels, 17% in fact is the proportion of fossil fuels that is attributed to the industrial agriculture and food supply system, 17% of global usage of fossil fuels. And food miles is a hot topic, one I'm sure many of you have heard of. We did some research and found that the average vegetable shipment travels 1,600 miles to make it to your plate. The average fruit shipment, 2,400 miles. And your average processed food item falls somewhere in between. Now, another issue with our current food system is the required inputs to sustain the system means monoculture, monocropping is often used. This is easy to see when you go on Google Earth and look at some of the fields in the area. They're all the same color, they all look the same. Now what monocultures bring about is pest problems like the Irish potato famine, for example, pests and disease. And so to combat that, generally it's been accepted that we use pesticides and herbicides. Now, it's been estimated that there are 3 million tons of pesticides that are applied every year globally. And we've found that it's been reported that only 0.1% of these pesticides make it to their target pest, meaning the other 99.9% is left to harm the environment. Now, some of the environmental detriments from pesticides include our honeybee population, nature's pollinators. I see some people nodding their heads, yes. The population of honeybees has shrunk by 3/4 in a span of 10 years, and that's from 87 to 97, so I can only imagine it's a little worse now. There's been reports of amphibian abnormalities, and also there are particular species that are pesticide resistant. This number has grown from less than 20 insect species to more than 500 pesticide-resistant species in 1989. Pretty staggering. Now, short-term effects of pesticides, there are millions of illnesses that are reported each year and upwards of 10,000 deaths. Those are the short-term effects of pesticides. The long-term effects, quite obviously, are far-reaching. Now, food contamination is unfortunately for all of us another problem inherent in the food system. There are all sorts of foodborne pathogens that make their way into and onto our food. Millions of diseases, millions of illnesses per year. I read that in the US, pardon me, these are US statistics, but there was 1,800 deaths attributed to foodborne pathogens. Of these 1,800 deaths, 75% could be linked to Salmonella, Listeria, and Toxoplasma. Now, Salmonella is a pretty common foodborne pathogen, one that we've all heard of, and one that's typically been associated with poultry. However, unfortunately, fresh produce is catching up with poultry in the spread of Salmonella. And often it's much worse because the distribution channel is much wider. You might recall in 2006, there was a recall on baby spinach and mesclun from California. The picture on your left is actually a Salmonella strain found on that baby spinach. If that doesn't make you queasy and want to wash your produce, I don't know what does. Anyways, further, I mentioned earlier agriculture's impact on our watershed and through pollution. One devastating example that we often reference is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the dead zone is a 20,000 square kilometer area that is in a hypoxic environment, which means there's a lack of oxygen. This lack of oxygen has been attributed to nitrogen runoff from fossil-based fertilizers stemming from the croplands that are adjacent to the Mississippi River. 20,000 square kilometers. Species can't live. And finally for me, the front lawn. Now, this, as it stands today, is it's a bit of a resource hog, you might say. But what Julie is going to explain to you is how we can look at the front lawn a little different and see it as an opportunity.
Great, thank you. So fortunately for me, I get the positive side of the presentation. So I get to tell you all the good things there is and what we can do as individuals to help. So I'm going to talk a little bit about front lawn First, it was a British invention born out of the 1800s, and it was a symbol of prosperity and wealth. If you had a front lawn, you didn't have to grow your own food. You could pay someone to do it for you. So in North America, somehow it creeped across the pond, and now it's widespread here. Every year, 160 million liters of fossil fuels are burned in taking care of our lawns, in push mowers and other gas machines. Every year, 30 to 60% of household water budgets are used on making the front lawn green. Every year, 3 million tons of fossil-based fertilizer is used to make my lawn greener than my neighbor's, and every year 30,000 tons of pesticides and herbicides are used to make sure that my lawn has no weeds or bugs. This is a crazy statistic. These are crazy statistics, if you can think about that. This is a resource that's not used for anything productive. It just sits there. And yes, we do get some joy out of the lawn. Our kids can play on it, and it's a fun area for recreation, don't get me wrong. But it is an opportunity, and we see it as an opportunity. So we're going to turn this on its head. Let's transfer every front lawn in the United States of America, 40 million acres, into wheat. 1 acre grows over 2,700 kilograms of wheat. 1 kilogram of wheat is equal to 3,400 calories. If we transferred all these front lawns to wheat, we could feed the entire population of the United States for a year with over 2,500 calories per person per day. If the United States population increased by a third, we could still feed everyone at 2,000 calories per person per day. So what that means is, all the farmland that exists right now could go back to wilderness, and species wouldn't have to live in fear that they're going to become endangered or extinct. And what that means is we'd live more healthy, less expensive lives. So one thing we know for sure is that the world's population is not decreasing. The United Nations predicts that in 30 years, the population of the world is going to grow by 2 billion people. So that means that with 2 billion more mouths to feed, we're going to have to get creative if we're going to if we need to stop depending on a system that relies on a finite resource, which is fossil fuels. So as you can see behind me, this is a skyscraper in Singapore, and they become creative with urban agriculture, growing vertically and finding opportunities to grow food when space is constrained. And so this is the type of thing that you're going to see more and more as cities and populations grow larger, because it is in the cities that this population growth is going to take place. Partly because there's already large populations there, but also because people are migrating from rural areas. So vertical and urban agriculture is really, really growing. And it's something that we always encourage. We know a lot of people in Calgary who have a 10 by 5 balcony off their apartment, and they grow their vegetables for the entire year off that small space. So we know it can be done, and we've seen lots of innovative ideas around in our talks and studies. So if we know that there's all this front lawn to be used, we say grow your own food. We say take an area of your backyard or front yard and turn it into a garden. It takes a little bit of work up front, we recognize that, but if you situate your garden in the right place, you make sure you have access to water, and you design your system correctly, it can be very little work. Jason and I have a 1,600 square foot garden at our acreage, and we spend 5 hours a week there. 5 hours a week for food for the entire growing season, produce specifically, but then we also have chickens, for 5 hours a week. I think that's a pretty good trade-off. So if you don't have space in your own yard, you can grow in a community garden. We have 2 in Lethbridge. One is the Campus Roots Community Garden at the U of L, and the other is the Grow It Community Garden Association on the north side. Unfortunately, they're both full, but they're both looking to expand and accommodate more growers. And Coaldale just opened up their own community garden, and they have lots of plots available. So if this is something you're interested in, you don't have space of your own, but you're really interested in meeting like-minded people and creating a community around food, please contact us or research the Coaldale Community Garden. And if you're interested in maybe supplementing what you grow, or you don't think you can grow enough for your family, if you have a large family, please visit farmers markets. The United States Agriculture did a study, and they started tracking the number of farmers markets that are popping up. And in 1994, there were only 1,700 farmers markets. In 2011, there were over 7,000. From 2010 to 2011, the number of farmers markets grew by 17%. And this growth is staggering. Organic food, same thing. It's growing by 15 to 21% per year since 1998. Regular food sales at a grocery store only grow by about 2 to 4% a year. So exponentially, blowing regular grocery sales out of the water, which is very promising. People are catching on. Organic and local is becoming cool. It's becoming something that people are thinking about. But we encourage more of it. We need a critical mass for policy changes, for people to start taking notice. We need more people to start buying into this idea. Another thing you could possibly do is join Community-Supported Agriculture, or CSA. And a CSA model operates like this. I pay $600 to my farmer, and in return I get a share of his farm or a portion of his harvest. So every week I receive a basket full of fresh vegetables grown by my farmer. I develop a direct link between me and my food and me and my grower. And what that means for my farmer is he has operating costs, operating capital at the beginning of the season, and a guaranteed market at the end of the season. And CSA model has helped a lot of small farmers who would have otherwise gone out of business because of large agriculture stay in business and continue to grow food and provide food for people. So it's a really good option, and I know there's some in the southern Alberta area. So 20% of the average grocery bill is spent on produce. And the National Garden Association of the United States did a study and found that a highly functional backyard garden could account for 1/3 of your produce needs. So you could supplement 1/3 of your groceries just by having a garden in your backyard. And we encourage you to do this. And one thing that's sort of intangible, but one of our most important elements of growing your own food and being reconnected with your own food is the opportunity for community. So community is a really important thing that I think we're losing, and that our system that we're proposing, and this is something that we really feel strongly about. We need to bring back the community, bring back getting together and doing productive things, transforming people's yards, and it's also a lot of fun. Yeah, in essence, sustainable agriculture isn't a do this, do that method. I mean, we can't just tell you step by step what you can do. It's a change in mindset. It's a realization that we can't rely on a system that depends on a finite resource. It's encouragement for farmers to think of their systems as ecosystems, and think of their farms as ecosystems, and not deal with problems in isolation with herbicides and pesticides. And it's an encouragement for all of us to think about where our food comes from, what's in it, how does it affect our environment, and how does it affect our health. Because ultimately, the decisions we make today, and the lack of foresight potentially we have today, could affect the lives of tomorrow.